The letter came in early spring, when the Boston streets still carried the gray hush of winter. Eleanor Price had been mending lace gloves in the window of her aunt's shop when the postman rapped on the glass. The envelope was thick, the handwriting bold and masculine, and her heart gave a small, startled jump before she even broke the seal. It was from Samuel Reeves, a rancher in the Montana Territory, a man she had never met. He had seen her notice in a Christian ladies' journal, the kind printed for women of good standing seeking honorable marriage in the West. The letter was careful and direct. I am a man of the high country. I own land, cattle, and a cabin fit for two. If you come, I will see you cared for and cherished. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it against her chest. She had lost almost everything the year before. Her parents to illness, her small inheritance to debt, her reputation to whispers she never deserved. A proposal from a far-off stranger seemed almost mercy from heaven, so she wrote back. And within a month her passage was arranged. The westbound train roared across the plains like some iron beast hungry for horizon. Eleanor sat pressed to the window, watching towns shrink into dots of smoke. She wore her best traveling dress, a blue wool gown that had known better years, and in her lap rested Samuel's final letter, where he'd written of tall pines, clear water, and a view of the mountains that could make a man believe in God again. Each mile pulled her farther from the polite lies of Boston and closer to something wilder, freer. At night she dreamed of a cabin fire, a man's laughter, and a peace she had never known. When the train stopped in Helena, a driver met her with a small wagon bound north. You'll want to brace yourself, ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. Reeves's place is a good 2 days past the trail most folks dare ride. Eleanor smiled, though the wind bit at her cheeks. I've come this far, she replied. By the second day, snowflakes drifted through the pine branches and the trail narrowed into a steep climb. The driver frowned. Reckon we're close, he muttered. You'll find Mr. Reeves right pleased to see you. But when they crested the last ridge, the only soul waiting was a tall man on horseback, wrapped in a dark coat, his hat pulled low. Eleanor's breath caught. He looked nothing like she'd imagined Samuel Reeves. Brooding, silent, his beard shadowed by the gray light. The horse stamped restlessly beneath him, and he raised a hand for them to stop. You the bride? He asked, voice rough as gravel yet strangely steady. Eleanor's gloved fingers tightened around her carpetbag. I am. Eleanor Price, Mr. Reeves's fiancée. He dismounted, the snow crunching under his boots. Up close, she saw that his eyes were a pale, tired blue, the kind that had seen too many winters. Name's Luke Reeves, he said. Samuel's brother. She waited for him to continue, but the pause stretched thin between them. Then quietly he said, You'd better come inside. The weather's turning. Something in his tone made her heart sink. The cabin stood against the mountain like it had been carved from it. Rough logs, smoke curling from the chimney, a corral half buried in snow. Inside, the air smelled of pine pitch and coffee. A single rifle hung over the hearth. Eleanor set her bag down and turned to Luke. When will Samuel be back? She asked. I was told he would meet me here. Luke's jaw worked as if the words pained him. Samuel, it won't be coming back, ma'am. She blinked. I don't understand. He drew a long breath. My brother's gone. 2 weeks now. Hunting accident up near Black Creek. I sent word to town, but it seems it never reached you in time. For a long moment, only the wind outside dared speak. When it broke through her shock, the grief came sudden and hot. Not for the man she'd known because she hadn't known him, but for the hope he'd represented. The promise of belonging somewhere, of being wanted. It felt as though the future itself had been yanked away. I came all this way, she whispered. What am I to do now? Luke looked at her, and beneath the rough lines of his face there was something like regret. You'll stay here tonight, at least. Storm's rolling in. We'll figure the rest come morning. As night fell, the wind rose to a low howl. Luke set another log on the fire while Eleanor sat near the hearth, her travel cloak pulled tight around her. Shadows played on the cabin walls, flickering against his shoulders as he worked. Was Samuel like you? She asked softly. He stopped for a heartbeat. No, ma'am. Sam was the talker. Easy smile. Folks liked him. And you? Luke's eyes lifted, steady but unreadable. I do better with silence. The words should have sounded cold, yet they didn't. There was warmth in the way he said them, as if he meant silence could be safe. Outside, snow struck the shutters. Inside, the firelight painted the air gold. When she shivered, Luke rose and draped a heavy blanket around her shoulders. His hand brushed the edge of her collar. Just a moment's contact, but it lingered in her pulse long after he stepped away. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'll take the chair." She wanted to argue, to insist he keep his bed, but the exhaustion of travel and sorrow dulled her will. As she lay beneath the blanket, she watched him by the fire, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. Something inside her softened. Whatever burden he carried, it was a heavy one. Morning came pale and silent. Snow lay thick on the roof, cutting off any thought of leaving soon. Luke poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed again, and this time neither drew back quickly. "You don't owe me charity," she said. "Once the road clears, I'll find work in town." Luke shook his head. "Nearest town's near 30 miles through pass country. You wouldn't make it alone." "Then I'll hire a guide." "I ain't letting you risk that," he said. His voice was firm but not unkind. "My brother brought you here. Until you've got somewhere safe to go, this is your home." The word home caught her by surprise. She searched his face for mockery and found none. "But Samuel," she began. Luke turned toward the window where the snow still fell in soft, endless sheets. He'd want someone to keep this place alive. He built it with his own hands. A pause. "He'd want you looked after." The fire popped. Eleanor felt something shift quietly in the room. A sense that grief had made them kin, though neither had asked for it. At last she said, barely above a whisper, "Then I'll stay. For now." He met her gaze across the small cabin. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was something else, an understanding, fragile but real. Outside, the mountains disappeared into white, but inside, a faint warmth began to grow, as if the storm itself had decided to wait and see what might come of the two souls it had stranded together. The snow did not stop that day or the day after. It came in slow, heavy veils that blurred the mountains and swallowed the trail they'd ridden in on. By the third morning, Eleanor could no longer tell where the sky ended and the earth began. The world was white and still except for the steady crackle of the fire Luke kept alive. Inside the cabin, time moved differently. The clock on the shelf had stopped sometime in the night, but she hardly noticed. Each day began with the sound of Luke splitting wood and ended with the smell of smoke in her hair. Eleanor tried to keep her hands busy, mending torn sleeves, sweeping the floor, washing tin plates in melted snow. But every chore was a way to avoid the hollow ache that came when she thought of why she'd come west at all. One afternoon, as she struggled with the latch on the shutter, Luke's shadow filled the doorway. "Wind's picking up," he said. "You shouldn't be by that window." "I was only—" she began, but a sudden gust tore the shutter open. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand catching hers on the latch. Together they forced it shut, their shoulders pressed close. The warmth of him seeped through her sleeve, startling her more than the cold air. When the window was finally barred, she turned to thank him and found herself caught in the pale steadiness of his gaze. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Best not let the wind win," he muttered. The silence after felt fragile, like the air after lightning. That night the storm grew cruel. Wind clawed at the roof and howled down the chimney. The fire sputtered, throwing restless shadows across the room. Luke checked the door latch twice, then added more wood. Eleanor sat wrapped in a quilt, trying to read by lamplight, but her eyes kept drifting to the man by the hearth. The light gilded the rough line of his jaw, the shape of a life spent outdoors. He moved with quiet purpose, every motion steady, deliberate. When a loud crack of thunder rolled across the valley, she jumped. Luke looked over. "It's only the pass echoing," he said, voice softer than before. "I'm not afraid," she insisted. Though her fingers trembled slightly, he smiled. Barely there, but it softened his face. "No shame if you were." After a moment, he reached for the kettle and poured hot water into a cup. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "Sage tea. Helps when the air's too thin." Their hands brushed again as she took it. The steam rose between them, carrying the faint scent of earth and smoke. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded and sat opposite her. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, their shared silence felt almost gentle. By morning, the blizzard had deepened. Snow climbed halfway up the windows. When Luke opened the door, the wind hurled powder into the room like a living thing. Looks like the mountain means to keep us a while, he said. Eleanor tried to smile. Then we'll have to keep each other, won't we? He looked at her for a long second, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he shut the door and said quietly, "Reckon we will." They settled into a rhythm born of necessity. He chopped wood. She baked what little flour they had left into rough biscuits. When he came in from the cold, his coat dusted white. She brushed snow from his shoulders before she could stop herself. He blinked in surprise but didn't pull away. In the evenings they talked, slowly at first, about the cattle Samuel had kept, about the wild elk in the ravines, about Boston's streetlights and how they looked like strings of stars. Luke listened more than he spoke, yet each word he offered carried weight. One night he said, "Sam always talked about you. Said you had courage. I didn't believe him till now." She looked down at her hands. "I only did what I had to." He shook his head. "Takes more than duty to ride this far into nowhere." Something in his tone made her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him that loneliness could drive a woman farther than courage ever could, but she couldn't bring herself to say it aloud. On the fifth night, the temperature dropped so low the fire seemed to shiver. Eleanor woke to find her breath a mist in the air. She rose to add wood, but the door to the woodpile wouldn't budge. Snow had sealed it from the outside. Luke woke to the noise. "Leave it," he said, getting up. "I'll fetch what's left from the porch. You'll freeze out there." He gave a half smile. "I've seen worse." Before she could stop him, he pulled on his coat and disappeared into the white. Minutes passed, too many. The wind screamed against the walls. Eleanor's worry grew until she threw on her cloak and opened the door. He stood in the drift, shoulders bent against the storm, arms full of logs. She ran forward, grabbed one end of the bundle, and together they wrestled it inside. When the door finally shut, she was shaking, half from cold, half from fear. "You shouldn't have," he began. "Neither should you," she cut in, eyes bright. "You'd have frozen if I hadn't come." He stared at her, snow melting in his hair. Then, slowly, he reached out and brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "Reckon you saved me then." The touch was brief, almost hesitant, but it left her breathless. The days blurred into one another. The storm became their world, a cocoon of snow and silence. They learned the rhythm of each other's movements, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way her laughter lightened the cabin's dark corners. One evening she found him carving a piece of wood by lamplight. "What is it?" she asked. He held it out. It was a small horse, rough but graceful. Sam's mare. Figured I'd remember her that way. She traced the curve of the carving. "You're good with your hands." He gave a small shrug. "Only thing that ever made sense to me." Then quieter. "Sam used to say I spent too much time alone." Eleanor smiled faintly. Maybe he was right. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the space between them felt smaller than the cabin itself. Toward the end of the week, the storm broke. Sunlight spilled over the drifts, blindingly bright. The cabin creaked as if waking from sleep. Eleanor stepped outside, boots sinking into snow that glittered like glass. The air was sharp and pure, filling her lungs until it hurt. Luke joined her, standing a few paces away, hands in his pockets. "World looks different after a storm," he said. "Yes," she answered. "Cleaner, quieter." He glanced at her, his voice low. "You plan to leave once the road clears?" She looked toward the distant ridge. "I don't know where I'd go." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Then stay until you do." It was not a command, nor even a request, just a simple truth spoken into the cold morning air. But it settled deep in her chest, heavier than any promise. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Eleanor felt the faint stir of belonging, not to a place, but to the moment itself. The storm had stripped the world bare, leaving only what mattered. And standing beside Luke Reeves, the mountain man who had carried his grief in silence, she felt that something new, something quiet and steady was beginning to grow where loss had lived. When the snow finally melted off the eaves, it left the mountain smelling of pine and damp earth. Patches of green showed through the drifts and water sang in every hollow. The worst of the winter was over. Yet neither Luke nor Eleanor spoke of her leaving. Each morning she helped him with chores, gathering kindling, mending harness straps, brushing the mare that had survived the storm. The work gave rhythm to days that might otherwise have been too quiet. Still, a different silence often fell between them, one that had nothing to do with the mountains. Eleanor noticed the way Luke's eyes lingered on Samuel's rifle above the hearth, how his shoulders tightened when the wind blew from the north, carrying the scent of pine and memory. He carried his grief like an extra weight across his back, one she could not see but often felt. One afternoon she found him at the corral, staring out at the thawing hills. "You've been miles away," she said gently. He didn't look up, just listening. When the snow goes, the land starts talking again. Hard not to hear old things. Old things? He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Voices, memories, my brother mostly. Eleanor stepped beside him, resting her gloved hands on the fence rail. "You loved him very much, more than I ever said." He was the one with the easy laugh. "I always figured we'd grow gray side by side, him talk in circles while I fixed fences." His voice roughened. "Didn't think I'd outlive him." The wind stirred her hair. "What happened, Luke?" He hesitated. Then slowly the story came. They had gone hunting near Black Creek. The sun was low, the snow deep. The cougar came from the rocks, fast and silent. Samuel shouted a warning, fired once, and then the ridge gave way. Luke's breath caught as he spoke. She could almost see it happen through his words. The flash of claws, the tumble of snow, his brother's body between him and death. "By the time I reached him," Luke said, "there was too much blood." He just smiled and said, "You always were the lucky one." Eleanor touched his arm. "He saved you because he loved you. That's not a thing to be ashamed of." He turned toward her, eyes shadowed. "Feels like a debt I can't pay." "Then maybe it isn't a debt," she whispered. "Maybe it's a gift." The air between them shifted. For the first time since that night she'd arrived, Luke's expression softened, not in grief but in quiet gratitude. That evening, she lit the lamp while he cleaned the tack by the fire. The golden light drew warmth back into the room. Outside, the creek murmured through the thaw. Eleanor poured coffee and handed him a cup. "You never told me why you stayed up here," she said. "Most men would have gone down to town long ago." Luke looked at the flame. "Town's too loud. Up here you hear what's honest. Wind, trees, your own mistakes." She smiled faintly. And now a stranger's voice added to the mix. He met her eyes. Not a stranger anymore. The words hung there like a promise neither of them had meant to make. Later, as she banked the fire, her hand brushed his. They both froze. There was no need for words, just a pulse of warmth that said what neither dared. She withdrew first, but her heart stayed close to that moment. Spring pushed hard into the valley. The road cleared and wagons began to move again beyond the pass. A trader stopped by one morning bringing news and a few supplies. He greeted Eleanor kindly but eyed Luke with curiosity. "Didn't know Sam's brother was still keeping the place," he said. "Sorry for your loss." Luke nodded, jaw tight. When the trader left, Eleanor watched the dust of his wagon fade. "Does it hurt hearing his name like that?" she asked. "Hurts more when folks forget it," Luke said. She set a hand lightly on his sleeve. "Then we'll remember him together." For a long while they stood in the doorway, the wind tugging at her hair, his broad frame a steady line beside her. It felt like the beginning of something new, though neither dared name it. As days lengthened, laughter began to return to the cabin. Eleanor discovered Luke had a dry humor that surfaced at odd times. A crooked grin when she burned bread, a quiet chuckle when the mayor stole his hat. These small moments stitched comfort where grief had once lived. One night after supper, they stepped outside. The sky blazed with stars, the kind that made the mountains look like they were holding up heaven itself. Eleanor folded her arms against the chill. "I've never seen a sky like this." Luke pointed toward the northern ridge. "That one there's the hunter. Sam used to say he watched over us when we were boys." She followed his gaze. "Maybe he still does." He glanced at her then, and something eased in his face, like the first thaw after a long freeze. "Maybe he sent you here," he said quietly. The words startled her. Why would he do that? "So I'd remember how to talk to someone again." The honesty of it stole her breath. She turned her face toward the stars, blinking back the sudden sting in her eyes. A few nights later, thunder rolled across the peaks. Rain swept down in sheets, drumming on the roof. Eleanor woke to find the cabin flickering with lamplight. Luke was up, checking for leaks. She rose and handed him a dry cloth. "You never stop working," she said. He smiled faintly. "Storms don't wait for daylight." When the wind rattled the shutters, she flinched. Luke's hand found hers almost without thought, steady and warm. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe here." Something inside her steadied. She didn't pull away. The storm raged, but in that small cabin the air between them turned calm. By midsummer the mountain was green again. Flowers crowded the creek banks and eagles rode the thermals high above. Eleanor had begun to hum as she worked. Luke found himself listening for it, the sound threading through his day like sunlight through leaves. One afternoon she baked bread and caught him watching her. "What is it?" she asked, half teasing. He shook his head slowly. "Just realized this place doesn't sound empty anymore." Her smile trembled, full of feeling. "Then maybe neither do we." In the quiet that followed, both understood something had changed. The ghost of Samuel Reeves still walked these hills, but he no longer stood between them. He was part of the wind, part of the land, and perhaps part of what had drawn them together. Luke stepped closer, his voice low. "You've given this place life again, Eleanor, and you've given me a reason to stay," she answered. Outside, the evening light poured over the mountains in gold and rose, and for a moment, it seemed the world itself held its breath, honoring the peace that had finally come to two hearts once broken by loss, now finding the courage to begin again. By the time winter began to unlace the mountain's frozen grip, the cabin had grown quiet in a way that wasn't just weather or wind. It was something between them, something neither of them dared to name. Eleanor had taken to keeping her hands busy, mending old coats, washing tins, folding blankets that didn't need folding. The silence of the wilderness was gentler than the noise of her thoughts. Every time she looked at Caleb, the man who wasn't meant to be hers, she felt a weight pressed down on her ribs. He moved around the cabin like a man carrying a ghost. Some nights she caught him staring into the fire until dawn threatened to break, his face caught between shadows and memory. That night, the snow came again. Fine, white dust whispering through the dark. The fire crackled low and Eleanor sat near it, her shawl drawn close. She was darning a pair of his socks, though they hardly needed fixing. Caleb stood by the window, looking out into the storm. "Mountains breathing again," he murmured. Eleanor glanced up. "You say that like it's alive." He turned his head just slightly, the faintest smile ghosting across his face. "Sometimes it feels that way. When you live up here long enough, everything talks if you're quiet enough to listen." She laid the sock in her lap. "And what does it say tonight?" He hesitated, then said, "That nothing stays buried forever." The fire popped between them. Eleanor felt the words sink deep. She looked down at her hands, the needle frozen midair. She'd known this was coming, the moment he'd finally speak of his brother. When he sat across from her, she could see the strain in his face. The stormlight flickered across his cheekbones, catching the faint scar that cut near his jaw. "Your letter," he began slowly. "The one you brought with you? My brother wrote it the day before he left for the hunt." Her breath caught. He meant to meet me." "He did," Caleb said, voice rough with something more than grief. "He'd planned to build the cabin by spring. Sent word for you to come, but..." Eleanor waited. "He never came back." Caleb's eyes found the fire, not her. "We searched for him for weeks. Found his horse, his rifle, but not him, just blood on the snow and tracks that disappeared by the ridge." Her throat tightened. "You think the storm took him?" He shook his head. "No, I think men did. Outlaws maybe, or worse, but I never found proof." The silence after that felt like an open wound. Eleanor's voice trembled when she said, "You could have sent me away, Caleb. You had every right to." His eyes finally met hers. There was no anger in them, only a kind of weary honesty. "I thought about it. First few days I almost saddled my horse to take you down the mountain myself, but you'd come all that way through the cold with no one waiting for you. What kind of man would I be to send you back to nothing?" Her heart ached in her chest. "You gave me kindness when I didn't deserve it. Deserve's got nothing to do with it." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "We both just needed someone." For a long time neither spoke. The fire dimmed, then flared again as a log shifted. Eleanor looked at him differently then, not as her dead fiancé's brother, not as the man who'd taken her in out of duty, but as someone who had carried his own share of sorrow, and yet still found it in himself to protect her. The edges of her grief softened, replaced by something warmer and far more dangerous. Caleb reached for another piece of wood and fed it to the flames. The light danced on his hands, his arms, the hollow of his throat. She wanted to say something, anything, but her courage faltered under the weight of everything unspoken. Finally, she rose and crossed to the window, pretending to check the wind. Her fingers brushed the frost-laced glass, cold against her skin. Behind her, his voice came, quiet, rough, careful. Eleanor. She turned, and the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. You don't have to stay here forever, he said. When the snow clears, I can take you to town. There's a train east in early spring. And where would I go? She asked softly. To strangers? To start again with nothing? He hesitated. You could find someone else. Her lips trembled, though she smiled faintly. And what if I already did? Caleb froze. The fire snapped loudly between them, filling the silence. She stepped closer, slow and uncertain. I know what this started as, she whispered. I came here for your brother, not for you. But since that night you found me half frozen on your porch, you've been the one keeping me alive. And I can't tell anymore where gratitude ends and something else begins. Caleb's breath came uneven, his jaw tightening as if to keep words from spilling. Eleanor. Don't what? Don't make me want something I shouldn't. Her heart pounded. Why shouldn't you? He looked up at her then, eyes dark, voice thick with everything he'd buried since his brother's death. Because he wanted you first, because I swore I'd protect what was his. And what if I choose you? She asked, voice breaking. His breath left him like a punch. He stood slowly, closing the distance between them until the firelight brushed both their faces. Then God help me, he said hoarsely. I wouldn't know how to stop. They stood there for a long time, two souls caught between guilt and longing, past and present. The mountain howled outside, the snow curling around the windows like white smoke. Eleanor reached out, just barely brushing her fingertips over his sleeve. It was a small thing, that touch, but it felt like crossing a canyon. Caleb didn't pull away. He only looked down at her hand, then at her face, his breath trembling. You should get some rest, he said finally, though his voice was soft now. Tomorrow's work will come early. She nodded, stepping back slowly, her pulse still wild in her chest. When she turned to go, he said, almost to himself, Your brother ordered me. Eleanor stopped, confused. Caleb's eyes were still on the fire. That's what you said that first night. Your brother ordered me. His voice grew quieter. Funny how life works, isn't it? He's gone, and somehow you're still here. Her eyes stung. Maybe that's how it was meant to be. He looked up then, and whatever passed between them in that instant was not duty. Not debt, only something raw, fragile, and real. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small bed, listening to the storm batter the roof. Every time the wind moaned through the cracks, she thought she heard Caleb's voice again, steady, low, full of everything he didn't dare say. And though she knew the world beyond the mountain would call her a fool, she found herself whispering into the dark, then stay. The snow began to melt the week the robins returned. For months, the mountains had been white and silent, wrapped in their winter sleep. Now, thin streams of water carved down the hillsides, whispering like secrets through the pines. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar smoke, and the wind carried the soft song of returning life. Eleanor stood on the porch, shawl pulled tight, watching the forest come alive again. The mountain looked different without its shroud, wild and green, but not as lonely. Maybe it was her that had changed. Behind her, Caleb stepped outside, his boots crunching softly on the thawing earth. He'd been mending the fence since sunrise, sleeves rolled, arms streaked with dirt. Even in weariness, there was strength in the way he carried himself, like a man who'd spent his life carving survival out of stone. You're up early, he said, voice still rough from sleep. I couldn't, she said, glancing toward the trees. The wind kept whispering, like it wanted me to listen. He gave a small, knowing smile. Mountain talks to you now, too. She looked up at him, warmth flickering in her chest. You were right. If you stay quiet long enough, everything speaks. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them filled with all the things they hadn't said. Since the night by the fire, neither had spoken of what passed between them. The near confession, the almost touch, the words that had trembled on their lips. Caleb had buried himself in work, repairing the roof, cutting wood, tending to the small patch of land that would soon be garden soil. Eleanor had helped where she could, though her heart ached each time he turned away before his eyes could meet hers. But spring had a way of stirring courage. It melted more than just snow. It loosened the grip of fear. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky in golden rose, Eleanor found him sitting on the porch steps sharpening his knife. His dog, an old brown mutt named Ranger, rested by his feet. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. He looked up, brushing a thumb along the knife's edge. "Storm season's ending. I was thinking what comes next, and what does." He hesitated, then nodded toward the valley below. "There's a town down that trail. 5 days' ride if the river's low. You could find a home there, a place of your own." Her hands tightened around her shawl. "Is that what you want?" Caleb's jaw flexed. He sheathed the knife and stood. "It's not about what I want. You deserve a life, Eleanor. People, laughter. You've been trapped up here all winter because of me." Her eyes glistened. "I wasn't trapped, Caleb. I was saved." He froze. She stepped closer, voice trembling but steady. "Do you remember the night I arrived? You opened the door and I told you your brother ordered me." He nodded slowly. "I remember. I thought I'd stepped into another man's life, that everything I'd dreamed was gone. But then you took me in, you made room for me more than any stranger ever could." Her eyes met his, clear and sure. "Somewhere in all that snow, I stopped waiting for the man who died and started living beside the one who stayed." The silence between them deepened, no longer empty, but full. Caleb's breath hitched, his eyes searching hers. "Eleanor." He said her name like a prayer. She took another step. "You said once that nothing stays buried forever. Maybe that's true. Maybe love doesn't die. It just finds another way to live." He looked away, trying to steady himself, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "I tried to keep my promise," he said hoarsely. "I swore I'd protect what was his, not take it." Tears welled in her eyes. "You did protect it. You protected me, and I'm not his anymore, Caleb. I never truly was." The knife fell forgotten to the porch boards. In 2 strides he was standing before her, the firelight from the cabin flickering behind them, gold on his face. "Say it plain," he whispered. "Say what you mean." Her voice was barely breath. "I want to stay." Caleb closed his eyes as though the words undid him. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only the raw honesty of a man who had run from his own heart too long. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing her cheek. "You sure?" Eleanor leaned into his touch. "I've never been sure of anything." He didn't kiss her, not yet. He only looked at her, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, as though he were memorizing what he'd been too afraid to want. "I thought the mountain took everything from me," he murmured. "Turns out it brought you instead." "And I thought I was coming here to meet a stranger," she whispered back. "Maybe I still did, but he's the one I was meant to find." Spring settled over the cabin in the weeks that followed. The creek ran strong again, carrying the last of the snow away. Caleb built a new fence, planted rows of beans and potatoes. Eleanor filled the small garden with flowers she found by the stream, wild daisies, mountain bluebells, tiny bursts of color against the brown earth. Sometimes they worked side by side, saying little, their movements speaking what words couldn't. Sometimes he'd pause, wiping sweat from his brow, and just watch her, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. At night, they'd sit by the fire, sharing coffee and quiet stories. She told him about the sea she'd never seen, and he told her about the stars, the way they looked from the highest ridge, sharp and close enough to touch. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she answered that letter, but it was life all the same. Real, steady, and full of quiet miracles. One morning, as the sun rose over the valley, Eleanor stood at the edge of the ridge, her skirts fluttering in the cool wind. Caleb joined her, his arm brushing hers. "Looks like the world's waking up again," he said. She smiled softly. "So are we." He turned to her, the early light catching in his eyes. "You sure about this? About staying?" Eleanor looked at him. This man who'd been stranger, savior, friend, and something far deeper. "You once said I could leave when the snow cleared. Well," she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "The snow's gone, and I'm still here." He squeezed her hand, a rare, full smile breaking through his usual restraint. "Then stay," he said, voice low and sure. And she did. From that day forward, the mountain no longer felt like exile. It became home, wild, imperfect, but theirs. The cabin filled with laughter again, with small joys and shared work. Each evening when the sun dropped behind the pines, They'd sit together in the quiet and the world would seem right. In the hush of the thawing woods, love had finally taken root, born from grief, grown in snow, and strong enough to last through any season. And when spring gave way to summer, the two of them stood before that same fire where everything had changed hand in hand, no longer haunted by the past. The promise that had once belonged to another man was now theirs, rewritten by time, by loss, and by the courage to love again.